Thank you very much. Well, so we have this this session about the ontology of economic and demystification. And so we have two papers. First, my paper, Ricardo Crespo from Argentina, which is about the ontology of the economy, linking proposals. And then we have the paper of Jorge Morales, who is Cuban but live in Austria. And his paper is about the demystification of David Ricardo, famous for numbers. So, well, I will share my presentation now. I start, let me see where it is. Here it is. Are you seeing it, Jorge? You are muted. I do not know.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
well, thank you very much. So my paper is about, well, the title is The Ontology of the Economy Linking Proposals, as I have said. And the idea is that during the last years, some proposals of developing an ontological analysis of the economy have appeared in order to ascertain the appropriateness of economic methodology. There is a crisis in economic theory, and well, the field of methodology and philosophy of economics has appeared or has reappeared. And well, some of the proposals of this field are to analyze what is the nature of the economy in order to ascertain which is the best method given the nature of the economy. And in the paper, I considered three proposals, three contemporary proposals. First, Nancy Cartwright's focus on capacities, which are for her, stable causes, that actually implies an ontological perspective that she applies to the economy. Nancy is a philosopher of science, but she has worked on physics, on chemics, on hard sciences, but also in economy because she was a professor at the London School of Economics. Meoqui, which is a Finnish philosopher of economics, conceives that economic ontology is a prerequisite for understanding economics as a science. And Tony Lawson from Cambridge also proposed to develop an ontology of the economy as a way of correcting the mistakes of standard economic theory. So the third authors that I have decided to deal with in this paper are contemporary authors that are worried about the ontological nature of the economy. But the paper will first introduce the Aristotelian position on ontology of economic reality, because Aristotle is one of the first metaphysicians and has applied his metaphysical categories to the economic realm. In his book, Politics, in chapter 1 or book 1, he deals precisely with the economy. Then the paper will introduce Cartwright, Meoqui, and Lawson conceptions, and will look for Aristotelian links. It's interesting that although there are different proposals that we can distinguish very well, the third proposal have some links I propose to with Aristotle thought about the ontology of economics. So first, Aristotle on the economy. First of all, we have to say that oikonomike, that is the word that the Greek word that Aristotle uses, is an adjective, not a noun. And so we have to ask the economic what, because economic calls for a noun. And the answer is multiple. This is a thing that I developed in the paper. Economic applies for Aristotle to several things and not univocally. First, well, it is an analogical or homoiotic per gen term for Aristotle in Greek. First, for Aristotle, the economic is a human action, economic action, the use of what is needed for achieving the good life. The good life is have a precise meaning for Aristotle is eudaimonia, that is happiness, but it's not happiness in a hedonic sense, but fulfillment or self-achievement. Then there is an economic capacity, a dynamis. Third, there is an economic habit, the capacity and the habit that eases a good performance of economic actions. And finally, we have the science, the economic science, which is for him a practical science, that is to say, a moral science. So what is the ontological condition of these four dimensions or ways of being of the economic for Aristotle? Action, capacity, habit, and science. Action belongs to the category of action because, well, Aristotle have 10 categories. One is substance, and then there are 9 accidents. Within the accidents, we have this category of action. Capacity or dynamis is a power, to have a power, is a source of movement or change, is a quality, which is another accident for Aristotle. Habit is also a quality, a having. Knowledge and science are qualities also, concretely a kind of habit. These 4 meanings of oikonomike, consequently, correspond to accidents of the human being, which is substantial. That is to say, there is a base, a ground on which the economic inheres. This has a consequence, is that depending on the kind of substance, or the kind of, which is a human person or an institution, also constituted by human persons, depending on which is the person on the institution, the action, capacity, habit, or science of economic can have different characteristics. This is Aristotle. I now pass to Nancy Cartwright. Cartwright indirectly shows her conception of the economy when analyzing the difficulties to do economic theory. That is to say, she does not ask about the nature of the economy, but in an indirect way, she provides some ideas about what is economy by analyzing these difficulties to do economic theory. What are the difficulties? The instability of causes, the relevant influence of structural factors, and the general characteristics of the social world that applies to the economy, which are complexity, reflexivity, lack of control, and singularity. She asserts, most of what happens in the economy is a consequence of the interaction of a large number of factors. And I also quote her, the natural thought about the difference between the most fundamental capacities studied in physics and the capacities studied in economics is that the economic capacities are derived, whereas those of fundamental physics are basic. Economic features have the capacity they do because of some underlying social, institutional, legal, and psychological arrangements that give rise to them. So the strength of economic capacity can be changed, unlike many in physics, because the underlying structures from which they derive can be altered. I can see a parallel with Aristotle because I had said that in Aristotle, the different dimensions of the economic reality are accidents that inhere in a substance that are persons, human persons, or institutions. Here we have also the idea that the economic features have capacities because of some underlying social, institutional, legal, and psychological arrangements. We have the idea of a structure, which is the ground of basis of economic dimensions. She then suggests that we should try to understand how these structures affect outcomes. In conclusion, given that economic causes are highly dependent on structural circumstances and that we do not have many principles in economics, we need to find out how these circumstances affect the outcomes. These outcomes will consequently be special case conclusions, not general claims about the result of the capacity. That is to say, is highly context dependent. This is the idea of Nancy Cartwright, the economy. Now, Tony Lawson. Lawson maintains that there is a level of reality that is deeper than the observable phenomena, also the same concept that uses a basis or structure, a ground on which the economy is lying. These structures are composed by structures, powers, mechanisms, and tendencies, and are rules, relationships, and positions. The relation between human agency and those structures is bidirectional. Lawson affirms all social structure is produced, reproduced, and transformed through human practice, necessitating that structure and practice be conceived somewhat holistically as two essential, if distinct, aspects of the same process. This is why social reality is necessarily historical geographical. Social phenomena, in addition, are mentioned and possess emergent properties. They are not reducible to the lower level, but are conditioned and dependent upon it. So here I see the same idea of economy as something emergent from a ground that is different, that can be different and condition the way in which economy will manifest the characteristics of the economy. And finally, Meoqui. For him, economics deals with common sensibles, which are not necessarily material. For example, costs and benefits, tastes and choices, firms and households, money and market. In his first words, he spoke about folk economic views, and he compares them with precisely Aristotle Oikonomike. Economic phenomena, for him, are intentionally brought about by people in charge, like governments, firms, and ordinary people. These common senses are mind-dependent. Meoqui thinks that the empirical and social criteria for the relation of economic theories are limited. He instead thinks that the ontological criterion consisting in the way the world works is more relevant, and that this is a matter of causal processes. He also speaks of causal powers and mechanisms. He holds that the possibility of the existence of the economic realm somehow depends on the existence of the physical, the biotic, and the psychic realms, and that the functioning of the economic realm is shaped by the realms of morality and politics. Again, I see that there are some fundaments or some grounds, physical, biotic, psychical, on which the economy is lying. So the conclusion, and I'm finishing with enough time, Cartwright's concept of capacity is taken from Aristotle's idea of natures, and she has the idea of a structure that is lying behind the economic realm. Lawson's ideas of underlying causes and tendencies is also Aristotelian. Meoqui's notion of all economic resembles Aristotle's Oikonomike. And well, there are interesting common ontological characteristics of the economy according to these ontologies, despite some difference between them. And the the common idea is that the economy is something accidental that lies on a ground that can change and that condition the characteristics of the economy. Well, thank you very much. That's all. I will. So if there are some questions or comments, some ideas.
Well, if possible, if you don't mind.
What is your name? Because
Oleg.
In Syriac. Sorry?
Oleg.
Oleg.
My question is, well, you took 3 authors, and these authors really have some common positions, but in economics and in economic methodology, we have also other authors who are not speaking directly about ontology of economy. What ontology do they have, according to you?
Well, there are different ontologies because I think that the field of philosophy of economics is very have very multiple positions. There are some human that is a human positivist ontology. There are also postmodern ontologies. And there are some Kantian, especially because which is compatible with the human, because we do not know what is ultimately the substance that is lying behind phenomena. And so we can also deal with phenomena and try to design some structures, build some structures that are behind them. So
you think that some kind of agnostic
exactly
possible as an ontological view? Agnostic is as ontological. Well, thank you.
Well, we can, from an Aristotelian point of view, that would be an oxymoron, because for Aristotle, reality is reality, and we cannot say that we cannot be metaphysical and at the same time agnostic for Aristotle. But we speak about Kantian metaphysics. That's or Kantian ontology. So there are different visions of what ontology is.
Well, it seems that the problem is whether is it possible to do some economic theory without some ontological assumptions.
It's impossible. Some
do not know the subject, then it's not an assumption, positive assumption.
Okay, exactly. The assumption is there, probably underlying and unknown, but it's there.
I have some questions to follow up on the previous person. First, is your paper available? I just didn't know, because I'd be quite interested in looking at it.
Okay, I can send it to you.
Yeah, I'd be quite interested in seeing it because I'm not familiar. I'm not that much of a philosopher of economics, but along the lines of the previous questioner, I'm wondering about, there's some perspectives in economics that focus on issues of power. So, I mean, from Marxist perspectives, and I'm also thinking more recently, sort of, you mentioned postmodernist feminist perspectives on issues of sort of power relationships. And related to that, there's sort of been some recent comment on behavioral economics and perspectives of sort of what is assumed about sort of rationality or irrationality. And I just heard a recent presentation. There was some French seminar, and I can't remember the woman's name. I know she's based in Denmark right now, based on feminist philosophy of science perspectives, which would have sort of postmodernist things. So I'm just wondering how those might fit into some of the people you just sort of overviewed.
Well, I think that they do not deal with this question of, well,
Because there are going to be ontological issues involved, right? I mean, there are.
Yeah, they're ontological, but I did not see in Lawson, Cartwright, and Meoqui references to the feminist position, and but Lawson speaks about powers, and you can think that he could have been thinking in this, but he is not explicit about this. Yes, I do not know. As soon as I know the work of these three authors, I do not know. I have not find references to this postmodern or feminist ontological positions.
What about behavioral perspectives? How would those fit in, do you think?
Well, I think that
you know, and assumptions about rationality and so on.
I think that behavioral has to be taken into account because, well, it's precisely the idea that the economy depends on the psychic, also and on emotions. It's an ontological issue that has to be taken into account, I think. I also did not see if Cartwright, Meoqui, and Lawson refers to behavioral. Probably their work is parallel or previous in some case, in some of their works to today blooming of the behavioral perspectives. But I could say that they would take into account this perspective because it is also realist, absolutely realist. So, and we have to insert these new forms of rationality into economics, and that is realism, and this is ontology.
Okay, thank you.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for the question.
Yes, I have a question. As I understand it, the term economics comes from the Greek.
Yeah.
But it was meant to be household management, translated. That's why the fathers of the discipline call it political economy, to say it is the management of the polis, the city state at that time. When Aristotle speaks about this term, does he mean what we understand now under economics, or does he mean more household management, or does he mean both?
No, he means both. He means he speaks about the household management, but also the management of the polis. It was something very, how to say, simple, because the economy of his time does not have the characteristics, the complex characteristics of today's economy, but there were commerce, international commerce, exchange, and so it's interesting to read this first book of politics, because there are a lot of ideas that were there, I would say, seminal ideas about the economy that are very interesting, and so and especially these ontological characteristics. What is, sorry, Oleg, your last name? You are muted. I cannot hear you because now.
Yeah, we met in St. Petersburg in 1912 at the
Yes.
Conference. Okay.
Yes, I was. Your face was familiar from me. That's what. And was it the last name, Oleg?
Ananin.
Yes, I know a bit of Cyrillic. Okay. Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I would say that Jorge can start with his presentation. You are muted, Jorge.
Okay, everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
So, thank you very much here from Vienna in the lockdown. So, I will talk about Ricardo's famous four numbers. For 200 years now, economists have been fascinated with Ricardo's famous four numbers about the barter trade of English clothes and the Portuguese wine in chapter 7 of the Principles. Paul Samuelson even referred to them as Ricardo's four magic numbers. According to Ronald Findlay, they prove the deepest and most beautiful result in all of economics. And for Danny Roderick, the law of comparative advantage is one of the crown jewels of the economics profession. Japanese economist Takashi Negishi claimed that it is one of the few theories that economists of all the different schools understand and agree with. The public, the general public, however, does not seem to share this fascination with the theory of comparative advantage. And some time ago, Paul Krugman wrote in an essay titled Ricardo's Difficult Idea, Why Intellectuals Don't Understand Comparative Advantage. And the essay ends with the following statement. Ricardo's idea is truly, madly, deeply difficult, but it is also utterly true, immensely sophisticated, and extremely relevant to the modern world. So let's take a look at Ricardo's four magic numbers. It is the famous example of English cloth and Portuguese wine in the column. In the first column is the cloth, second column is the wine. England exchanged clothes, sent clothes to Portugal in exchange for wine. It cost England the labor of 100 men. If she would make the wine, it would cost her 120. Portugal, the wine cost 80, the labor of 80 men working for a year. And if she would make the clothes by herself, it would cost 90. Economists have been fascinated mostly or almost entirely with the cloth column. Why? Because as the production of clothes required less quantity of labor in Portugal, economists usually infer that the cost of production of the Portuguese cloth was lower than that of the English clothes. So this was the fascinating aspect. This inference, however, is wrong because the Portuguese clothes has a higher cost of production than the English clothes. I will not get into the explanation because the proof of this claim can be found in a recently published article in the Journal of the History of Economic Thought. The present paper contains a summary of this proof. I will talk more about the interpretation of this new insight. So Ricardo was actually explaining these two numbers that appears in the diagonal. because for him, the original purpose of the four numbers was to illustrate the proposition that the relative value of two lots of commodities produced in different countries is not determined by the respective quantities of labor devoted to the production of each. This exception results from unequal ordinary profit rates between countries, because capital does not move across national borders as easily as it does within the same country. Here is important to say that Ricardo doesn't say that capital doesn't move, because at his time, capital was moving between borders, but it was not moving as easily as it would be if it would move within a country. So capitalists at the time, even if the profit rate was higher in another country, they could earn more money, they didn't necessarily move to that country or move the production to that country in order to seek higher profit. This interpretation debunks three myths about Ricardo's numerical example. The first myth is that Ricardo left the terms of trade unspecified. He didn't. He said that the clothes and the wine, a certain quantity of clothes is exchanged by a certain quantity of wine. So it was defined. The second myth that is debunked by this interpretation is that the four numbers were to illustrate the gains from trade. Of course, there are gains in this trade, but the four numbers doesn't illustrate these gains, but represent a correct application of the classical rule for specialization. This is what I call the classical rule for specialization. What does this rule say? This rule stipulates that one should not attempt to make a commodity that costs less to buy, and that it is generally beneficial to import commodities whenever they are bought more cheaply than what their internal production would cost. The third myth to be debunked by this new interpretation is what I have called the productivity narrative, and we will have a closer look to that. Originally, John Stuart Mill, in his famous essay, he was the one who coined the contraposition between absolute and comparative cost of production. And he stated there that it's not the difference in the absolute cost of production which determines the interexchange, but the difference in the comparative cost. This contraposition merged in current economic textbooks into the following: international trade is based on relative rather than absolute advantages in productivity. So this is what I call the productivity narrative, and it's explicitly said that this was actually what Ricardo meant, and this is the Ricardian model that one can find in all these textbooks. I believe that this is a false narrative. It is not what Ricardo meant, and it is actually not possible to affirm these kind of things based on Ricardian theory, because there are important incompatibilities between the productivity narrative and Ricardo and the principles. The first one is that according to the productivity narrative, one needs all the four numbers to determine the trade pattern of the countries. In Ricardo, you only need two numbers. He says that it is in the interest of England to produce the clothes and export it only by looking at the numbers of England. He doesn't mention the Portuguese numbers only later, when he said that it's also in the interest of Portugal, this trade. So he only needs two numbers, not four, as the productivity narrative. The second difference is that according to the textbook, the country with a higher productivity is Portugal, because Portugal needs a lower quantity of labor to produce the clothes. But I believe this is not what Ricardo meant, because in Ricardo, this quantity of labor includes not only the labor directly applied to to the commodity, but also the machinery. So when one take machinery into account, it can well be that a country that has more quantity of labor using, it is half laborers and half machinery. And the other country has a different proportion. So what I believe is that actually in Ricardo's example, England was the most productive economy. This corresponds to the historical reality of his times. England was the most productive economy at that time. So, and everybody was criticizing Ricardo why he chose Portugal as the most productive country. This would be against history, but he didn't, I believe. It was just misinterpreted. The textbook doesn't say anything about higher profits, because they say that Ricardo only used one factor of production, labor. This is not true. I mean, Ricardo speaks about profits all around the four numbers. Actually, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it is quite easy to infer that he believes that the higher profits to be made were in Portugal. That's why he said if capital would move between countries as easily as it does within the country, the English capitalists would move to Portugal, seeking the higher profit rates. They don't do it because it was at that time not so easy to move capital. Also, the textbook says that Portugal has higher wages. This is against historical reality. Well, I believe Ricardo thought that England had the higher wages. That's why he thought that England had a lower profit rate, because according to his theory, higher wages imply a lower profit rate, and vice versa. And probably the most important thing is about the make or buy rule. Should I make a cloth or should I make wine? And actually, the textbook rule for that is not equivalent to Ricardo's rule. What does this mean in practical terms? In practical terms, it means that the textbook rule might recommend an exchange that Ricardo would have considered detrimental for one of the trading countries. So in summary, we can draw the following conclusions from the demystification of Ricardo's four numbers. First, there is no continuity between Ricardo's numerical example and the theory of comparative advantage in econ textbooks. Second, all successive developments in international trade theory resulted from misinterpretations and false narratives about the four numbers. Third, the long-standing mystification of the four numbers has revealed a poor understanding of Ricardo's theory of value across all the major schools of economic thought. And the last one, these results highlight the importance of reading the classics. Of course, I don't have to explain to historians of economic thought the importance of reading the classics. But as you will know, there are plenty of economists who don't read the classics. They think it is not worth their time. And there is a little anecdote in Twitter that happened 1 month ago. I will like to present for that. There was actually this discussion in Twitter, and it was about Branko Milanovic and Florian Ederer. And Ederer said almost everything worth reading in economics is covered at length in grad level textbooks. So if you want to read the original text, there is a discipline for you, comparative literature. So he was saying actually when one is reading the classics, one is not studying economics, one is not doing economics, one is just trying to make some sort of comparative literature. Danny Roddick, also a famous economist who called comparative advantage one of the crown jewels of the economic profession, he took a middle ground and he said, well, one should read some classics, but not always. And he mentioned exactly comparative advantage. And he said, so to understand comparative advantage, you do not need to read Ricardo. Well, I think that he is partly right. If you read Ricardo, then you don't believe in that comparative advantage theory that is in the textbooks. Edera said, he agreed partially, and he said, I do not dispute that there is some research value in reading the classics, but I personally think that the opportunity cost of doing so is too high. I hope with this presentation that you will gain some the impression that it is valuable to read Ricardo in the original and try to understand him. For me, it was the cost was worth it at least. And the last one, there is in this discussion, it went back and forth, and the one that was particularly funny was from Rudy Bachmann. He said, you read Ricardo, I try to solve real world economic questions, okay? So I hope that one can do both. Actually, I believe that understanding the classics is important to understand current economic questions. Actually, I started reading the classics when I was trying to answer the question if free trade would be important or would be recommendable for developing countries. So my question was about the real world. I just landed studying the classics because I wasn't satisfied with what I was reading. So finally, to come back to Ricardo's 4 magic numbers. The word magic reveals a very human trait, namely that of admiring things and assigning them magical properties when we cannot find an adequate explanation for them. When properly understood, there is nothing counterintuitive about the 4 numbers, much less magical. So the magic is gone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Very interesting presentation. Yes.
Thank you.
And make us think about the importance of reading rightly the classics. Well, are there comments or questions? I have to read your paper. Yes, and I will try to send this paper to some colleagues that teach history of economic thought, because I do not know what version of Ricardo are they teaching.
Well, thank you very much. It would be very interesting because this interpretation actually is, I cannot say, there is a whole debate about the theory of comparative advantage. Mostly free traders defend this theory very much, and those who are against free trade, of course, criticizes. Both sides claim to understand it perfectly, and this position is actually that both sides don't understand it, or what they understand is not the original case in favor of free trade that Ricardo and actually Adam Smith made. That if you take the original claim, there is a much better case for free trade than the one that economists are currently making. Of course, this position is not liked by any of the 2 sides because it proves, or it argues, that both sides are wrong on this issue for different reasons. Those who are in favor are theoretically wrong in what they are saying about Ricardo, and this has implications for the case in favor of free trade. And those who are criticizing Ricardo and the Ricardian model and saying that because it's not realistic, protection is a better policy than free trade, I argued that they will have a hard time discussing the real case for free trade that Ricardo and Smith made.
Well, may I have a question? Jorge,
Yes.
you said that the supporters of the conventional view of this Ricardian theory do not understand his labor theory. How would you comment on the relationship of this comparative advantage and labor theory?
Thank you, Oleg, for this question. I'm sorry if I say Oleg. I don't want to be disrespectful, but thank you, Oleg. Well, actually, the key to understand Ricardo is to understand that to understand his theory of value. And I believe that the labor theory of value is not a good explanation for his value theory. He never said that he had a labor theory of value, and his concept of value was explicitly that of the natural price, which he called cost of production. And this is probably the problem here, that for him, the natural price and the cost of production was one and the same. He used both terms. But of course, when we think cost of production, we think about the cost price of something without the profit rate. This was not for Ricardo. He said explicitly that the cost of production includes the ordinary rate of profits. So this was the main misunderstanding of John Stuart Mill, because for John Stuart Mill, the cost of production was the cost price, actually, what we would say now, not that of Ricardo. So I believe Ricardo didn't have a labor theory or a theory of value. Ricardo just said that he thinks that when two commodities have the same cost of production or natural price, then the quantity of labor is the same. And then he analyzes in books when this is not valid. And one aspect where this is not valid is, for example, in international trade. This is exactly the four numbers that he is saying. He says that the exchange of English clothes has 100 men working for a year, and it is exchanged for 80 Portuguese men working for a year. So this would be, of course, not possible under the labor theory of value. There have to be the same quantities of labor. So, but for Ricardo, this was not a problem because this was just an exception of this rule. His concept of value was very much so natural price and cost of production.
Well, thank you. You see, I agree with this, and I came to similar conclusions coming from another side. But one point about Ricardian value in the context of comparative advantage. I agree with you fully that for Ricardo, what is important, what matter, is just comparison of two industries within each country, not between countries. That is crucial point. But Ricardo defines this exchange from the point of view of production of costs or values produced in England, that is the labor of English workers. He takes into account only English workers, and their production is sold to another country, and the labor of the imported commodities he calculates in labor of their own workers. In this case, Ricardian definition of labor of imported commodities become tautological, because it depends only on the work of labor of native country. So this is kind of, I think, deficient point in Ricardo, because there is a kind of gap between the point that he accepts that there is a gain from trade. Comparative advantage is a gain, but no gain in value for Ricardo, no gain in value. Gain is, let's say, use value, not in value. So that is something which is, which I think you are not discussing this point, but I think it is important also.
I will try to answer, Elio. What I believe is that actually he is comparing values between two countries, because he's comparing actually the cost of production in money. When he say that something is exchanged, when he say that English clothes and Portuguese wine is exchanged in barter, barter doesn't mean necessarily that there is no money. There is no money to exchange, but you need a price. If the price is the same for both, and I need your wine and you need my clothes, it doesn't, it makes no sense to send you money and you send me back. We can exchange the commodities, and this is barter. But when he says that they exchange this, so he is presuming a price, and this price has to be the natural price or the cost of production. And in his theory, the value of labor, you have also to come to this natural price, you have to add profits. So when in a country, the value of labor is low, there is a higher profit rate. When in another country, the value of labor is bigger, there is a smaller profit. This is his theory. So what he is comparing when he compares the different quantities of labor in England and then in Portugal is because this comparison you can only make within a country, because only within a country you can say that if a commodity requires more quantity of labor, then this commodity has to have a higher value, because within a country the ordinary rate of profit is the same. This is not true between countries, so this is why you cannot compare different quantities of labor between countries, but you can do it within one country. So this is the explanation that I found why I don't believe that his numerical example is tautological. It is just about something completely different than it has been used. So when you use it for explain, for example, international trade and the benefits of trade, there are a lot of open questions. This is if you would use one tool and apply it to something completely different for what it was not designed. Of course, it will not function, or it will not perform as a good tool. If you use the numerical example for what it was originally conceived, then it makes sense for what Ricardo was trying to prove.
Well, it means that labor theory does not work for comparative advantage. In fact, it doesn't applicable. It doesn't applicable. That's
it is always a question. What is it meant by labor theory of value? Because this is the main discussion here. If it means if it means that commodities are exchanged always with the same quantity of labor, this is not true within a country either. Ricardo actually has some sections in his book where he explains where this does not count, or where this does not valid is valid. The problem, what happens often is that Ricardo is interpreted through Marx's economic thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what Marx is saying is an analysis that it is on a higher level of abstraction than Ricardo. Ricardo is much closer to the real exchange, let us say, in the economy. So what Marx is discussing is something different. And actually, I believe that Marx has very much in common with all the classical political economists, particularly Smith and Ricardo. And he agrees actually with a lot. He certainly agrees with this natural price and cost of production. He just called it the price of production, but it is the same concept, it's just a different name. And the market price of commodities tend to this price of production, cost of production, or natural price. This is what all the three, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx have in common. The labor theory of value is, I think, is a false discussion or a problematic discussion with respect to their original value theory.
Well, I agree that they have different value theories, and you are right that if we are interpreted through Marx, then it will be different. But I agree actually with all you said, except for the fact that if we interpret exchanges on the basis of labor theory, then it is not applicable. Ricardian theory, it becomes a tautology. If we are, well, thinking in terms of a merchant who is exchanging in foreign trade, then that's okay, of course, you are right. So that is the only thing I wanted to add. But really, I agree that these misunderstandings of comparative advantage is widespread. That's true. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my sort of set of comments reaction is I mean, I think there's certainly great value to what you're doing and sort of clarifying what Ricardo was saying versus these other things. But I'm wondering, there is the issue of sort of what weight to put, you know, the last part of your discussion about what weight to put on, should we go back and read Ricardo versus more recent expositions, and how do we do that? And actually what comes to mind, you mentioned the comparative literature issue. I recently read this history of comparative literature at Yale and deconstruction and so on. And there's this whole issue of the status of canonical literature at Yale. And there was this course that was introduced in the 1960s, 1970s, where they would assign very popular works of literature along with Shakespeare and so on. And generally a lot of controversy within the Yale faculty about what weight do you put on contemporary literature, you know, Tarzan and so on, versus the classics such as you know, Shakespeare's plays and so on. Do you treat them differently? And the same issue I think comes up in economics. You know, how much weight do we put on Ricardo as viewed as a quote canonical text versus more recent sort of expositions, and how do we make sense of that? And it also comes to mind. So I recently, actually, for the first time, read Keynes's general theory versus sort of Keynesian exposition. And I think it's well known that there's big discrepancies between what Keynes said in the general theory and actual sort of various expositions of Keynesianism and so on. And to my view, you go back and read things, you know, writers such as Keynes or Ricardo, because they're sort of very great thinkers, and you learn something just by reading their exposition, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what they said should be treated as quote canonical versus more recent things. So there's that whole issue of how to sort that out. You know, should we still look at the Krugman-Gogsfeld sort of exposition in their textbook versus going back and looking at Ricardo's exposition and so on? So, I mean,
thank you very much, Professor Mitch. The problem is that actually economics is a very peculiar science in that respect, because people talk about Ricardo, people call Ricardian model, and it has nothing to do with Ricardo, or even it is contrary to what Ricardo said. So when one say hello, this is not what Ricardo said, they say yeah, but you know, this is like history of economic thought. It doesn't matter. We are talking like Ricardian model. I cannot imagine a different science where you could, or any field of knowledge where you could say, I don't know, for example, I don't know, Mozart wrote the Ninth Symphony, and people will say, no, it was not Mozart, it was Beethoven. Yeah, but this does not matter. It's a symphony, you know. So it matters who said what matters, because this is the basis of an exchange. Yeah. In what Krugman, for example, and Othfeld say, well, actually, Krugman said specifically that Ricardo, or the classical theory, cannot explain trade between developed countries. Actually, his new trade theory was about trade between countries that has the same level of productivity, or almost the same level of productivity. Well, the original Ricardo, the real Ricardo, can explain trade between countries of different stages of economic development, or the same. So it's not a matter of how can I say, just treat Ricardo as it would be like a sacred book. No, every economist has to be criticized. It doesn't matter how important the book is, or how important this economy is or was. The problem is to talk about the real theory, so then one can discuss what are the good things, what are the bad things, what is missing. If we don't get the theory right, we don't get the critique right. And this is actually the point that I was trying to make. So it is not about saying that everything that Ricardo said, even about international trade, is the last word. And but what it says is that what we believe was his last word is not his last word. It's the opposite. So this is like, and probably it is the same case that you were mentioning in Keynes is probably similar. People are saying, I am a Keynesian, and everybody supposes that, oh, because somebody say I am a Keynesian, everything he speaks is directly from Keynes, and it is as if Keynes were talking. The same happens, for example, with Marxists. When a Marxist speaks, everybody, and probably he too, or she, presumes that when she's talking, he is completely in line with Marx, and it is as if Marx were speaking through him or her. No, he or she can be saying something completely different or completely contrary to what Marx or Ricardo or Keynes said originally. Just because one is a fan of somebody doesn't mean that one interprets this person correctly.
I mean, I don't get me wrong. I mean, I think there's great value in sort of going back and clarifying what Ricardo said and pointing to the sort of, erroneous terminology and so on and calling that. But I guess where I have some issue, and it gets into the larger issue about sort of philosophical themes and ontology, is this notion that there's, quote, a correct theory, because we've already seen this issue about, various theories of value and how that comes into play. So it's not clear to me that there's, quote, a correct or right theory, but even though I think there's value in going back and clarifying what Ricardo was really saying versus these terms about Ricardian and so on. So I think in some of these discussions, one could still, even though what's going on in, say, the Krugman-Obstfeld is not really Ricardo, one could still take their model on its own terms and then debate about doing that versus other ways of doing this. This opens up. The other issue that sort of comes up when you bring Marx into the picture, especially, is there can be a lot of issues about what Marx is really saying in terms of what texts there are, because there's a lot of those texts were put together by later people that really didn't reflect kind of what Marx was saying. And even that's why I think there's great value in these sort of collected works of Keynes and Ricardo and so on in terms of what they were writing. There can be big issues even about what they were saying at different points in time. You know, I mean, Keynes in the General Theory, there's treatise of money and so on. But so don't get me wrong. I mean, I think there's great value in what you're doing and clarifying what Ricardo was saying. But there's this issue of kind of what is the correct theory, I guess. You know.
Yeah, no, actually, you know, I'm Cuban, so we try to speak a little bit in absolute terms. Professor Crespo probably is familiar with that. When I say I don't mean it that absolutely, I can be wrong. You know, it's not that I believe that I am that what I am presenting is necessary. The last word about Ricardo. It is a contribution and an interpretation, and it's up to the others to say what value it has, if they think it's correct or not. It's not me who has to judge that. Luckily, you know what I believe is that the value theory. Is very important to economics. It is basic to economics. A lot of problems and a lot of perceived problems can be solved or can be looked differently if one has one value theory or the other. For example, it is often said that, for example, low wages for developing countries is a comparative advantage for these countries. So it is what they have to offer. Well, if one understands Ricardo's theory, he was the one who said that low wages do not determine the value of commodities. This means, by consequence, that lower salaries don't influence in the price of the commodity. When the salaries are low, it's because there is low productivity in this country, so you need a lot more workers than in the developed world, and you probably have a higher profit rate. So having low salaries, low wages is not an advantage at all. We all want to have high salaries, and we all do, every country, Cuba, Argentina, everybody wants to be a rich country. Nobody wants to be poor, so it has some sort of advantage in international trade that I don't think it is an advantage at all. From all the great trading powers in the world, none has low wages. And even China, which has had a spectacular development in decades, their wages are rising with the level of productivity. So they are not anymore the country with the lowest wages, not even by a stretch. And their wages are going up and up. So this is the reality. If you have one value theory, you can explain this. If you have another, you cannot. So this is why I think these discussions about value theory and price theory also and cost theories, all this together are very important to understand the world that we are living now. So it's not about figuring out what the world was when Ricardo was living. It is to find out whether what they said still applies now, which aspects apply, which not. And this is at least my approach to Ricardo and thinkers of the past, looking always from now and probably in the future, not necessarily back.
Well, thank you. Interesting discussion. Interesting, very interesting about Ricardo.
Thank you very much.
Well, if there is not, are there more questions or comments? If not, we can finish with this session. And thank you for you all, for Jorge and Oleg and David. Well, and
thank you very much.
well, bye-bye.
Bye.